As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner said on Thursday that the Biden administration has not set a deadline on Israel's war in Gaza and reiterated U.S. opposition to a ceasefire. Feiner said, quote, "We have not given a firm deadline to Israel, not really our role. That is their conflict. That said, we do have influence, even if we don't have ultimate control over what happens on the ground in Gaza," end quote. So when it comes to the timeline of this war, how long it could last, there was a report in Financial Times last week that cited Israeli sources who said they expect it to last over a year. I mean, imagine this thing going on for for a whole year. U.S. officials have said that they expect the current phase in the war, referring to the ground operations and the constant bombardment, they expect that to last into 2024. And then at some point, they're saying Israel will probably narrow down its operations to take out specific Hamas fighters. They say that could happen as soon as January. But who knows? I mean, Israel seems to be pretty happy with just obliterating the Gaza Strip. Feiner said that the U.S. supports Israel's goal of ensuring that Hamas can no longer govern. Although we've seen Netanyahu and Israeli officials, they're constantly saying their goal is to eliminate Hamas, which is a different goal from what the U.S. is saying, that to make sure they can't govern Gaza. Feiner said that the U.S. is, quote, "not in place yet of asking Israel to stop or for a ceasefire," end quote. So reiterating that no ceasefire, we want to continue supporting this thing. Gaza's health ministry put out another casualty update on Thursday. They said at least 17,177 Palestinians have been killed since October 7th, and that total includes about 70% of that is women and children. And their death toll is considered to be on the low end, something that the U.S. State Department has admitted. They're not accounting for the people buried under the rubble, which is in the thousands. There's thousands of people who are missing. They don't have heavy machinery to properly dig people out. So the Financial Times report cited a source who said that Israel was not near halfway to achieving its objectives. And the death toll that an Israeli military source said when it comes to the Hamas fighters, they're claiming that they've killed 5,000 Hamas members, although there were other reports citing Israeli sources who put the death toll between 1,000 and 2,000. Either way, who knows if these estimates are accurate, but either way, they've killed more children than both of them. I believe the child death toll is now around 7,000, which is just horrific. So the Senate on Thursday voted down a resolution that would have directed President Biden to withdraw all U.S. troops from Syria, where U.S. forces have come under frequent attack in response to President Biden's support for Israel's Gaza onslaught. The bill failed in a vote of 13 to 84, so it didn't do very well, but it did receive bipartisan support. 7 Democrats voted for it, 5 Republicans, and 1 independent, which was Bernie Sanders. The resolution was introduced by Senator Rand Paul, who argued the U.S. occupation of eastern Syria risks a major regional war. Paul said, quote, "Keeping 900 U.S. troops in Syria does nothing to advance American security. Rather, our intervention puts those service members at grave risk by providing an enticing target for Iranian-backed militias. Our continued presence risks the United States getting dragged into yet another regional war in the Middle East without debate or a vote by the people's representatives in Congress. Congress must cease abdicating its constitutional war powers to the executive branch," end quote. So this bill would have directed Biden to withdraw the troops within 30 days unless he could get a authorization from Congress. So this resolution received support from Robert Ford, who's a former U.S. ambassador to Syria. In fact, he was the U.S. ambassador to Syria under Obama from 2011 to 2014 when the U.S. threw its weight behind the regime change operation against Bashar al-Assad. And he has been supportive of lately, in recent time, with getting the U.S. withdrawing from Syria and lifting sanctions, saying, somebody very involved in the beginning of the U.S. intervention against Assad and what has led to, what led to that brutal war and all the funding of these, extremist groups in Syria. And now kind of the where we're at now, it's a continuation with the sanctions that the U.S. has on Syria. They're specifically designed to prevent the country from rebuilding after that war and this occupation of eastern Syria. And this guy Ford thinks it should end. So he said, quote, "We owe our soldiers serving there in harm's way a serious debate about whether their mission is in fact achievable. Absent a debate and authorization of such a mission, our troops should be removed," end quote. Ukrainian officials traveled to Washington this week to attend a conference on building up Ukraine's own military-industrial complex to reduce its reliance on the West for military equipment. Opening the conference on Wednesday, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said the U.S. and its allies would work to strengthen Ukraine's defense industrial base, which is the new lingo for military-industrial complex. And he's saying this will maintain Ukraine's current war effort and bolster the deterrence in the future. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told Reuters, quote, Ukraine becoming more self-sufficient in weapons production obviously alleviates the long-term need for continued supply of weapons from the United States and other Western countries, end quote. The U.S. and Ukraine are also looking to jointly produce arms. A Ukrainian minister who attended the conference said that Kiev had an agreement with 2 American companies to jointly manufacture 155mm artillery shells, which are in short supply as the U.S. has shipped millions to support the war against Russia. I believe they've given Ukraine over 2 million of those artillery shells.
Here's Gerald Celente with today's trends in the news.
All right, today is December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day. Before Pearl Harbor, some 80% of the Americans were opposed to getting involved in the war going on in Europe. But Pearl Harbor came, boop, changed. Oh, I mentioned the dot-com bust. The dot-com bust, you know what ended the dot-com bust? The war on terror. That's right. The little Georgie Bush with a pair of cojones smaller than a mothball, a stupid, moronic piece of garbage scum. We're going to get that guy Osama bin Laden dead or alive. Although Afghanistan had nothing to do with it, and we wrote in detail they wanted to have peace talks, and he wouldn't let them. 81% of the people swallowed his crap. Everybody forgot about the dot-com bust. Now let's go back to World War II. There was a thing called the Great Depression. That's right. World War II came. When all else fails, they take you to war. This is from this day in history. Mainstream site. United States freezes Japanese assets. On July 26, 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt seizes all Japanese assets in the United States. You know why? In retaliation for the Japanese occupation of French Indochina. Why, those dirty Japs? How dare they go into French Indochina when the French are in Cambodia, when the French are in Laos and Vietnam, stealing their rubber, stealing their tin, raping, robbing, pillaging. Why, those dirty Japanese? And as an American, what the fuck do I care? It gets better. Japan followed up by occupying Cam Ranh Naval Base in Vietnam, which was only 800 miles from the Philippines, where Americans had troops, and the British base in Singapore. What the fuck is America doing with troops in the Philippines? And the British, the sun never sets on the British Empire. We slaughter and kill people all over the world, and we're in Singapore. And again, don't forget to subscribe here, because you get notified. We're putting out what nobody else is putting out, so share this video. Nobody's saying what I'm saying right now. It gets better. President Roosevelt swung into action by freezing all Japanese assets in America. Britain and the Dutch East Indies followed suit. Dutch East Indies? What the fuck are the Dutch doing in Indonesia? What's wrong with you, Celente? We're stealing, robbing, and killing like we always do. So now the result. You ready? Japan lost access to 3/4 of its overseas trade and 88% of its imported oil. 88% of its oil. They only import 100%. Can't understand why they bombed Pearl Harbor. I don't understand. All right? You go on to the Israel war, same thing. 39 weeks of protests against Netanyahu's judicial reform. The guy, week after week, there's your Trends Journal from when Netanyahu got into office back in late 2022. We put week after week after week what they were doing to the Palestinians and Lebanon and Syria, ramping this up. Now go back to the protests going on. Isaac Herzog, the president of Israel, called this, what was going on with the people protesting week after week, hundreds of thousands taking the street, a civil war in Israel. October 7th happens, the terrible massacre created by Hamas. Everybody forgot about it. And they all united against Gaza and Hamas, bombs away. Nobody talks about the 39 weeks. When all else fails, they take it to war. And let's go on to also the data coming out that we began with Phil Giraldi, former top CIA guy, saying Israel had the best intelligence in the world. They knew this was happening. And now the data is coming out showing that that's the truth. So they knew this was going to happen, and they let it happen. So, again, you got political freaks in charge, and that's why you need your T-shirt here. Hey, politicians, who the fuck are you to tell me what to do? Here's another story. Students suffered biggest setbacks in pandemic. Yeah, no shit. We said this was going to happen, and it wasn't a pandemic. The World Health Organization called it a pandemic on March 11th, 2020, when the grand total of 4,219 people died out of 8 billion. That many die a day, choking maybe. But again, it fucked up everything. The damage done by the COVID war is incalculable. So now, in ending this, I'm going to say the same thing I say all the time. People say, why do you do this? Why? I say, I want to get out of here on a high note. I'm trying to do everything I can for peace, and I'm fighting for every ounce of energy that I have to do it. How can you be so stupid to call these people leaders? I want to make this clear. I was not put on this earth to be led. I won't be led, and I don't want to lead. But maybe you want little Mikey Johnson, who said, yeah, he's been talking to God. God told him to lead. Yeah, lead you down a crap hole of crap. So thanks for tuning in. Check out the video I did yesterday with Judge Napolitano.
So I think you might remember this, and we may have even spoken about it. About a month ago, Senator Richard Blumenthal, liberal Democrat of Connecticut, and Senator Mitt Romney, conservative, in his own words, Republican of Utah, and a former Republican nominee for president, said that the Ukraine war was the best of all worlds. We were getting the biggest bang for our buck, and no American was dying. Did they forget the generation of Ukrainian young men wiped out? According to Colonel Douglas McGregor, 500,000 either killed or so disabled they can't go back to the military.
Yeah, I mean, they've been cynically and immorally feeding these Ukrainians into the maw of death, at the cost of the American taxpayer, and it's just a crime. We have been abetting and aiding this ongoing war, which is getting nowhere, which will end exactly where it started, with the Donbass region being maintained by Putin. There's very little likelihood that that's going to change, and yet they want to continue it. And they have displaced, in addition to 500,000 some troops dying, they have displaced millions of Ukrainians because of this conflict.
And the members of Congress see no harm in this. In fact, as just stated, they see the opposite. They see joy. Incredible.
I mean, so they're really bent on destabilizing and, effectively creating a coup, a regime change in Russia. That's really the ultimate objective. And they really think that they can affect this through this insane funding and arming, but it's not going to lead to that at all. In fact, Putin's position economically and militarily have only been enhanced. This is a fool's errand and a criminal activity. It's incredible that the Congress has no scruples, apparently, about funding this particular campaign.
If Putin takes Ukraine, he won't stop there. It's important to see the long run here. He's going to keep going. He's made that pretty clear. Putin attacks a NATO ally. Then we'll have something that we don't seek and that we don't have today. American troops fighting Russian troops. American troops fighting Russian troops. He moves into other parts of NATO. Extreme Republicans are playing chicken with our national security, holding Ukraine, funding hostage to their extreme partisan border policies. And now they're willing to literally kneecap Ukraine on the battlefield and damage our national security in the process. Look, I know we have our divisions at home. Let's get past them. This is critical. Petty partisan angry politics can't get in the way of our responsibilities as a leading nation in the world. We can't let Putin win. Say again, we can't let Putin win. It's in our overwhelming national interest and international interest of all our friends.
Oh, I mean, Biden's remarks were premised on lies to start. He's suggesting that Russia will not stop at Ukraine. Meanwhile, there's no threat that Russia is going to take all of Ukraine. That's not even its objective. As a matter of fact, as has been revealed, there was, in fact, a peace negotiation in which Russia effectively said they would stop the war if, in fact, Ukraine promised not to become a NATO partner. So this whole idea that Russia wants to take over other parts of Eastern Europe is insane, and it's a complete lie. It's complete balderdash. And it is ridiculous that the United States Congress is putting as a priority, and I mean the Senate and Congress here, the security of Ukraine while our own border is completely wide open. And they will not, and it's called far right, to want to secure that border. That's called a far right-wing position. So I guess a non-far right position is just to allow unfettered immigrants, unfettered immigration to pour into the country and we have no idea whether these people have our best interests at heart at all. They may in fact be terrorists. So I mean, this is it's a ball of lies. There's absolutely no truth to what Biden is saying, and it has to be rejected. I hope that this funding to Ukraine ends immediately, because this is a fruitless, absolute fool's errand that we're on here in terms of funding and arming them.
You and I, and a lot of people watching us now, believe in natural rights, that our rights come from our humanity, whether you believe in an almighty, all-knowing, all-loving God, or whether you think that human beings are the highest rational beings on the planet. We accept the view that our rights come from our humanity, and as Jefferson called them, they're inalienable. What is the moral dimension to this slaughter? What is the natural law analysis or understanding of this kind of slaughter?
There's natural rights law, but also from the libertarian perspective, there's something called the non-aggression principle. And that is that you are not to initiate force against another person on your own without it being a defensive action. Now, in the case of civilians, in the case of war in general, I would argue, it's impossible not to violate the non-aggression principle, because always there's this so-called collateral damage with war. And we have a case where there's millions of people in Gaza that haven't done anything. They haven't initiated any violence against anyone, and yet they're being killed and maimed and displaced, and their property utterly destroyed. This is a clear violation of the non-aggression principle, and this is why the parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, can't come down on any two issues in the same way, because they have no principles from which to operate. And so I argue that the principle that we should operate from is the non-aggression principle. Unless it's a defensive move, unless you're defending yourself, your person and your property, you have no right to initiate force against anyone. And that's what's happening in Gaza. That's what's happening in the West Bank as well. And that's why, the lack of this principle is why you have both Republicans and Democrats solidly behind this slaughter, with a few exceptions.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network. Scott Horton sent me this, but there's John Robb on his Substack wrote this piece, and I got to say, Rob, you really called this one, and I think you called it pretty early on. I think our first, I have to go back and check, but I think our first show on this was on October 8th. I think we did a show the day after the attack, or we recorded it the day after the attack. It was one of the ones in a hotel room. I can't remember where we were. I think it was at the casino up at Mohegan Sun. We did one in my hotel room. But I think you said pretty early on in this that you were like, the Israel's going to have a really tough time selling this. It's just not going to go over well. Well, I highly encourage people to go read John Robb's Substack piece. It's called Israel's Online Front Collapses. And they're basically talking about what you predicted all coming true. And that the whole, in terms of like TV media, Israel's still kind of doing okay, controlling the narrative. But in terms of online, it has just totally collapsed. And support for them has just evaporated.
And before we even get into, the claim I had made is I just watched a building collapse. I don't know how you sell this. Like you just got put under a microscope. We're seeing what's happening. I don't know how you spin this. It doesn't make me feel good. I'm watching you kill civilians. Like I can see it. When I can literally see it, it's very hard to escape it, spin it, say, well, we dropped a leaflet. We told them they have to leave. I just saw it. I saw a building with civilians collapse. I don't know. It's like watching the Twin Towers collapse. I saw it happen. Right. You're not going to spin it the other way. You're not going to tell me, well, like they were harboring terrorists, the kids in there deserve, like, I don't know what you're going to tell me. I saw it. But Israel is also seemingly cartoonishly bad at social media when they did that campaign on the kids' videos where, hey, we know that your child can't see this, but give them a hug for their loved ones because we just lost ours and now we need your support. And then this was incredible. They kept claiming that that they needed to go after that hospital because it was the main artery, or it was the main base that they were running operations out of. And then they got this video of this guy.
Al-Shifa Hospital, yeah.
Yeah. And then they pivoted really quickly to, well, we're still looking for evidence. And look, there's a tunnel here. And then there was like less guns than what I've seen when, the police do a raid on a building in New York City and they go, look at all the guns we took off the street. And then they had this guy who goes, look, tunnel, Hamas. And then instantly, they were just making fun of that guy online and pointing at like hobbits and stuff. Look, Hamas. So
the crazy part about that, did we ever talk about this? So for people who don't know, what happened here was Israel had a raid on a hospital. And let's just say the standards are pretty high for how that would ever be legally permissible in a war. And so Israel put out this like computer generated graphic of what was under the hospital. And it was like, it reminded me of one of those Osama bin Laden, remember they used to do his caves where he had these crazy, like high sophisticated with tons of computers. It all turned out to be complete bullshit. They just made up these images. It's literally no different than when my daughter draws a picture and just makes something up out of her imagination.
Working with porn tapes. He didn't even have internet.
Yeah. He was jerking off to magazines. Yeah, I was going to say. Osama bin Laden and the other Al-Qaeda guys all had to go to the woods to try to find a porno mag. But so they put out this, the Israeli government put out this computer-generated image of how sophisticated this thing was. And that this was the central command for Hamas. And so we just had to raid this hospital. And yes, it's tragic and we hate that we had to do it, but we did. So then they go, and what they show us as proof were a couple of rifles in one of the rooms in the hospital. Now, look, maybe those, we really just have no way of knowing, because also the IDF doesn't let journalists come in until they've cleared the area. So we have no way of knowing whether these rifles were planted there or the rifles were really there. But I'm perfectly willing to believe that they were, in fact. And I think there was one person who worked at the hospital who did say that like some Hamas guys had been in the hospital and stuff. So not even claiming none of that's accurate. But then they basically showed you the opening to a tunnel. And so they show you the opening to a tunnel and they go, look, see, tunnel. And then journalists wanted to go in. They won't let them. They said, we can't go in because it might be booby trapped. And look, again, fair enough. It might be booby trapped. If that is a Hamas tunnel, you're like, yeah, that seems like it's a reasonable thing. That could happen. Maybe it takes time to get in there. Then, very strangely, in an interview, the former prime minister of Israel, Barak, is talking to this interviewer, and they go, they ask him, how can you be sure that there are tunnels under this hospital? And he goes, well, we know there's tunnels under the hospital because we built them. And he goes, I'm sorry, did you misspeak? You're saying you built them? And he's like, yes, we built them. He goes, we built this tunnel under this hospital back when we occupied
I
Gaza.
didn't hear about that part of it.
So now he says, and the reason for it was something about how they wanted to expand the hospital or something like that. So once that's said, you go, oh, well, now just discovering a tunnel isn't evidence of anything. Now, it's possible that Hamas took over these tunnels that Israel was building and were using them, but now just showing me a tunnel doesn't mean anything, because Israel built the tunnel. You already knew the tunnel was there. Anyway, they claim that they found some more weapons in this after they had like robots go in or something like that. But the bottom line is that
they walked it back. It's pivoted. So we're looking for evidence, and look, there's a tunnel, and look at there's this, which was a very different claim.
But nothing like that computer generated image that they first used as a justification to go sack this hospital. And really horrible. I mean, I don't even want to like get into some of it, but there's some really gruesome stories of what happened as a result of that raid to the hospital.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Elon Musk had just bought Twitter. I think it was like November 2022, last year, about a full year away. He invited Barry Weiss and some other reporters to come to Twitter headquarters and like trawl through the Twitter databases. And she had looked me up, and there's a picture of me in the Twitter database with the words, the little box, trends blacklist underneath it. I was put on a blacklist by Twitter. Elon invited me to go visit Twitter, and I saw what Twitter had done. I asked them to go crawl back to figure out when was I put on the blacklist. It turns out I was put on the blacklist in August of 2021 when I first joined Twitter. All I tweeted was the Great Barrington Declaration. And of course, there was previous to that, there was the revelation that the head of the National Institute of Health had called for a devastating takedown of me and my Great Barrington Declaration colleagues, professors from Harvard and Oxford, calling us fringe epidemiologists, and leading to essentially hit pieces by the Washington Post, New York Times, it's falsely accusing us of wanting to let the virus rip when we were calling for better focused protection of vulnerable older people. So it was really clear that there were government actors that were abusing their power to destroy any intellectual opposition to their policies, even before the Elon Musk purchase of Twitter and the Twitter blacklist revelation. But that just put a nail on it. And then there was the Missouri versus Biden case, on which this debate topic hinges, and that really opened the door to what the government was doing. And Tom, it's not just that they named particular people, which they absolutely did. The government would go to Twitter and to Facebook and Reddit or whatever and say to them, look, if you don't censor these people, then we're going to take regulatory action. But they would do more than that. They would say, you have to censor these ideas if you have these themes. And then they've outsourced it to places like Stanford, the Stanford Internet Observatory, to develop essentially like TrawlNet algorithms to say, here's the whole range of things you should be censoring. Here are the bad misinformation themes that are coming up. Ironically, many of those misinformation themes turned out to be absolutely true. And yet, so the government outsourced its censorship, laundered its censorship activities to private entities like Stanford. And then the government directly went to companies like Twitter, to social media, and said, look, you better censor these people and these ideas very broadly, or else You know, because you're just to give a concrete example, turns out that Facebook was needed the Biden administration to negotiate with the EU regarding data security, right? Because the EU essentially has all these regulations that puts Facebook business model at essentially a direct threat. And so what the Biden administration told Facebook, in effect, was that if you don't listen to us on censorship, we're not going to negotiate on your behalf in front of the EU, and your company will get destroyed. I mean, it was such an obvious direct violation of the American First Amendment that the federal judges that have looked at this, and this not just doesn't include the July 4th ruling by the Judge Sherry Dowdy but also a 3-judge panel in the Fifth Circuit. They both mentioned, like Dowdy calls it a ministry of truth, basically pointing to Orwell's 1984. That's the kind of activity. The 3-judge panel essentially endorses that view as essentially the biggest violation of the American First Amendment, certainly in this century, maybe even in 100 years. So I look forward to that ruling. I actually look forward to the debate because I'm curious to see what my opponent, what she's the one that suggested the wording of the debate topic. I think the word hindered. Like, what does it mean to hinder internet policy? Hindering internet policy such that the American government can violate the First Amendment at scale. That's really, I think, what is the content of what the debate is about.
Now, we can respond to that in two ways. Number one, we can address the merits of the things being censored, or we can just speak on the principle of the thing. That unfortunately, in a free society, maybe some people do say some things that are false. But the problem is, if you try to correct that, who gets to do the correcting? That's the question we get no answer to. Or if it's, quote, the scientific consensus said to put everybody on a ventilator in early 2020.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you give a nice articulation of the devil's advocate view, but you also answered your devil's advocate.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself, Jay. I couldn't help it.
I mean, I think let's look at that as carefully as we can and honestly as we can. All right, so the idea that somehow the federal government has in its employ a set of people who are so wise and so perspicacious that they can see forward into time about which direction every single scientific debate is going to go, and then in advance suppress the people that will take the wrong side of it. Right? So probably this is best personified by someone like Tony Fauci, who gave an interview, I think, to CNN, where he bragged that if you criticize me, you are not simply criticizing a man, you are criticizing science itself. The premise then is that the federal government and it has essentially a church-like power to tell the difference between sheep and goats. Like the people who are going to be condemned to hell, the people who are going to go to heaven. They can decree from on high the outcome of scientific debates that are still ongoing. Even if you believe that it's true that they have better scientific knowledge than the assembled masses, they might be wrong. I mean, the way science works, and you already presaged the answer to this. It's very commonly the case that the scientific consensus in one day is overturned basically overnight by a whole series of facts. And if you act on the false scientific consensus at scale with the power of a government to close businesses, to keep kids out of school for 2 years, to essentially interdict international trade for years on end, cause mass panic and fear at scale, what's going to happen is a great deal of harm, a great deal of damage is going to be done to people.
Start out talking about the Whiskey Rebellion. And this is a great piece by Murray Rothbard over at the Mises Institute. Of course, it'll be linked to in the show notes. Alan Mosley will get that organized, and I will get it published in the next couple of hours after the live stream is done here over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty. But you should check this out. The Whiskey Rebellion, a model for our time by Murray Rothbard. And he puts it this way. The official view of the Whiskey Rebellion is that 4 counties of western Pennsylvania refused to pay an excise tax on whiskey that had been levied by a proposal of the Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, in the spring of 1791. Western Pennsylvanians failed to pay the tax, this view says, until protests, demonstrations, and some roughing up of tax collectors in western PA caused President Washington to call up a 13,000-man army in the summer and fall of 1794 to suppress the insurrection. And Rothbard sums up the official view with this. A localized but dramatic challenge to federal tax levying authority had been met and defeated. The forces of federal law and order were safe. Now, Rothbard makes it very clear that this is just the official view. It's a government propaganda view. And he says the official view turns out to be dead wrong. What a surprise that so much in history is written by the supposed winners, by the people in power. And we always get a kind of a twisted version of it. Now, he just kind of rips through this whole official view. He said the main distortion of the official view of the Whiskey Rebellion was its alleged confinement to 4 counties of western Pennsylvania. From recent research, we now know that no one paid the tax on whiskey throughout the American backcountry. That is the frontier areas of Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, Georgia, and the entire state of Kentucky. Now, I don't know if it's a zero, but I see no indication that the whiskey tax was collected in any large numbers. In fact, it was very, very low. And in some areas, there was no collection whatsoever. Now, Rothbard continues with this. President Washington and Secretary Hamilton chose to make a fuss about Western Pennsylvania. This was a political strategy on their point. About Western Pennsylvania, they made a fuss about it precisely because in that region, there was a cadre of wealthy officials who were willing to collect taxes. Such a cadre did not even exist in the other areas of the American frontier. There was no fuss or violence against tax collectors in Kentucky, for example, and the rest of the backcountry, because there was no one willing to be a tax collector. If you think about the situation in comparison to what they did to the tax collectors in response to the Stamp Act, it's a very similar type of an approach. Now, Rothbard points out that Western PA was really just the tip of the iceberg. Pretty much everywhere else, it just was not really paid at all. And government today, whether it's state or federal, they often take this same kind of approach that Rothbard points out that Washington and Hamilton did. They make a big fuss, they make a big show of force in one area when there is widespread resistance to something because they want to make an example out of people. They want to make sure everyone knows that they mean business. They hope that it's going to scare off people in other areas. But if the people hold firm, the people in the states can win, which is exactly what we're seeing play out before our very eyes in response to prohibition on cannabis. Over the years, they've really ramped up enforcement, but generally they focus on one area. Just before Colorado opened up their legalization a number of years ago, the Peace President administration conducted the largest series of raids around the state in state history as a warning. 6 weeks before they started their legalization, retail sales, they're basically saying, hey, we're going to come in and shut you down. But that just never happens because they run out of resources if the people and the states continue to take a stand. But anyways, let's get back to Rothbard here. Here's what he has to say. Let me pull it up on the screen. Rather than the whiskey tax rebellion being localized and swiftly put down, the true story turns out to be very different. The entire American backcountry was gripped by a nonviolent, civil disobedient refusal to pay the hated tax on whiskey. So a vast majority of the people just refused to comply. This is exactly what James Madison said needed to be done to keep the feds in check in Federalist number 46. Rothbard says no local juries could be found to convict tax delinquents. The whiskey rebellion was actually widespread and successful, for it eventually forced the federal government to repeal the excise tax. And this is, as I just mentioned, this is really the same type of strategy that was used to nullify the Stamp Act back in 1765. It was a series of protests, noncompliance, pressuring local officials to step down, even having some local officials refuse to follow the Stamp Act. There was some local courts in Maryland, for example, that said it was unconstitutional and no one was required to obey it. So it's the same approach, and it had a very positive effect. In 1765, we saw the same thing play out in response to the whiskey tax, despite the fact that the physical resistance in Western Pennsylvania melted away in the face of a large kind of George Washington-led military force. But I covered the resistance to the Stamp Act in another episode that I think you'll find interesting, the People's Nullification of the Stamp Act, which really highlights a lot of the work from Murray Rothbard as well. Now, Rothbard sums this all up like this. He said, Washington, Hamilton, and the cabinet covered up the extent of the revolution because they didn't want to advertise the extent of their failure. They knew very well that if they tried to enforce or send an army into the rest of the backcountry, they would have failed. Kentucky and perhaps the other areas would have seceded from the Union then and there. Both contemporary sides were happy to cover up the truth, and historians fell for the deception. And a lot of people are still repeating that propaganda. We hear it all the time. Just like George Washington, they'll shut you down. And it's not the case. It just didn't happen like that. The Whiskey Rebellion, then, Rothbard sums up, considered properly, was a victory for liberty and property rather than for federal taxation.
Okay, now what's the purpose of this nihilism and my truth? It's because when you get into this mind virus, you become putty in the hands of the authoritarians. They become your source of truth. You know, you can't turn anywhere, but they, with their might, will tell you this is true because we say it's true. And that's what we went through with COVID. Remember when Fauci claimed to be the science? And what was it, New Zealand? Ardern, I believe. She says, we are the source of truth. And of course it was false, what they were saying. But that's the purpose of this nihilism, this my truth nonsense. And, and you got to get out of it. It's like a cult, and learn what is true. so that you could at least survive and prosper.
Right. But, in order to maintain the empire, one of the first things that they have to do, and they're working diligently on this, and that is they have to destroy the principles of the First Amendment. You just can't give out opinions. That's dangerous. And now it's announced by the enemy that just saying something is violence. The libertarian principles, you can't use any violence and you can't use aggression. But now they're saying verbaling, expressing yourself is a threat to people, and therefore what you say is equivalent to holding up somebody with a gun. But the one thing they exclude is, yes, they want the government to get involved in that and describe all these things, but they never apply these strict rules, which aren't just bad rules altogether. What they do is they exclude the government. If you and I can't do certain things, if we have to obey, governments don't have to. They have the power and the authority which people too often grant to them, and they don't wake up quickly, and we're in the process of doing that. And then the government are overwhelmingly more powerful than the people. Except there is some opposition to that, and one of them is there is a higher law. And there's still the majority of people believe in the higher law. You shouldn't lie, cheat, and steal and kill, and that's been there since Sumeria. Even well before the 10th Commandment. Those rules have been there, and deep down in the heart of all these authoritarians who want to use all this power on their own and the power they give the government, they know that. And when things get bad, which they are, all of a sudden they'll start saying, well, maybe we should be in this war. Maybe we should be more cautious. Right now, we're being more cautious about expanding our role in the Middle East. We've been doing it a lot, and they're talking about slowing up a little bit in Ukraine. And it took decades in the Middle East as well as in Vietnam to finally wise up and quit doing this. But there were rules about it. It was the breaking economic laws. Economic laws are very, very powerful. So yes, there's a lot of evil done when they control the money and they become the counterfeiters, but it won't last, and then that is expressed by higher prices, and the people don't like that, and they wake up and know something has to be done. But that requires, to get them to do the right thing, that requires on our part and others to make sure that the people themselves know what you have to do. And if you have to cut spending to save the country and save the economy, you better understand why it's done. So that's an educational matter, and we try our best to get involved in that as well.
So you need a big web of lies in order to maintain it. Our government, unfortunately, over the last 100 years, has become the global busybody. It deems itself the arbiter around the world. And predictably, everything is failing around it, even in foreign policy. Failed wars, they're endless. They keep just one piling after another. The currency is failing. Inflation is getting out of hand. And if they keep printing, it'll really get out of hand. Our cities are a total mess. I live an hour from a city. I don't even go there anymore. There's moral failure with the people. That's quite obvious. Just go on to social media and see how people speak to one another, and you'll see the moral failure. Legal failure. We have two-tiered legal systems. Some people, have to obey the law, and some don't. There's failure in trust in the media. To anybody who still puts that TV on, you really have to trust them. There's medical, failure with COVID, just the lies there. Education, school, we could go on and on and on. And eventually the people, they become numb to it. It starts to lose its potency, all the lies. They could speak all the lies that they want, and that's what happened with the Soviets. Nobody believed them anymore. And that was the beginning of the end. So that's in our future at some point. Let's just hope the end was as peaceful as it was for the Soviets.
It's a choice between authoritarianism and voluntarism. And people being left alone, they will use the method of how people get ahead is through merit, how they do things. Do they follow the rules? Are they honest? And that is what makes society a much better society, rather than saying what we need is more authoritarianism from the government, no more rules. And just think of all the pages of regulations that we have at the federal level. And the people who campaign for getting rid of them, they never reduce the number of pages in the Federal Register. So someday there's a lot of people now who are sick and tired of it, and they're starting to avoid them and ignore them. 80% of the people now don't trust what the government tells us. Those are healthy trends, because the people will finally wake up. Well, if we're not going to depend on our government, what are we going to depend on? And as far as I'm concerned, the only option we should have is promoting the cause of liberty. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.